patterns is that it's a sort of bunch of starchy academics projecting some sort of ideal world, how things should really be. And I think Brian can really help us sort of debunk that myth, because starchy academic doesn't exactly come to mind. And I think the patterns he's going to show today also talk much more about our sort of real developer life as opposed to some ideal vision. So knowing Brian, this will be entertaining and insightful, which is probably a good combination. So you can get something out of it one way or the other. So please help me welcome Brian.
Why, thank you. Thank you, Gregor. It's really a lot of fun to be here, and indeed, I do hate starch. I'd like to begin, as I did, with this story of the mysterious mound builders of Mountain View, because I think by better understanding the origin of these mounds and the strange rituals that surrounded them, we can better understand ourselves, and more importantly, our code. Indeed, the ethereal chanting that you just heard was recorded during such a strange ritual. I trust that you all recognize the majestic twin peaks that command the strategic heights to the north of the Googleplex. But I'll bet you all didn't know that these majestically sculpted mastiffs were not of geological origin, but were the work of man. That's right, folks, they're fake. I was strolling down Charleston Avenue last fall when the discussion turned for some reason to potential tsunami activity and the fact that we stood at the edge of an estuary and were presumably mere inches above sea level, and someone mentioned that the mountains of Mountain View would protect us. Now, I'd always assumed that Mountain View was named for the distant peaks that surround the town on three sides, and was surprised to hear that the newcomer to town was clearly under the impression that the mountains in question were these right over here, and moreover, that these were mountains at all. It is, after all, an easy mistake to make, I know. After all, we're software engineers, damn it, not geologists. Of course, not being geologists, but being software engineers, we prattled on about liquefaction and the like, and we all naively concluded that the event of a powerful earthquake or tsunami, there would be better places to be than the place that we were standing. But herein lies a tale, and it's a tale that I will return to shortly. Get back over here. But in the meantime, I'm the guy faced with the somewhat daunting task of meeting the lofty expectations that people who've elected, of their own free will, to attend a talk entitled Big Ball of Mud must be harboring. The Big Ball of Mud has turned out to be, God help us, our best known work. And I'm hoping that I can at least tell you something that will make you feel good about some of the things that we're going to be talking about, if I can't in fact tell you something that you already know. And with that in mind, I'll proceed. Now, first of all, I'd like to say that it's a treat to be back at the Googleplex. This is an exceedingly stimulating place to be. It's one that always leaves one palpably less stupid when one leaves than when one has arrived. People are always asking me what it's like to be here, and I tell them it's a lot like being at Starfleet Academy. For one thing, were this the 24th century, and they did have replicator technology, life at Google wouldn't be terribly different than it is now. Tea Earl Grey, anyone? So you need to go to a little more effort than Captain Picard did, but not that much. Books, laptops, network cables, clothing, they all just seems to appear. There's a post-scarcity, Roddenberry-esque, technotopian, post-national air about the place, the likes of which I've never seen. And then, of course, there are the cadets, brilliant young minds from every corner of every known inhabited planet in the universe, somehow conversing in perfect English. There is, of course, only one known inhabited planet in the universe. So let me get back to the mound builders. I was walking around the wildlife refuge where Permanente Creek flows gently down to the Mountain View Slough in search of inspiration the other day, and pondered the mountaineering challenge that you guys call the Vista Slope. I rested and returned the next day. I was emboldened by a keynote at Agile 2007 a couple weeks ago, where a woman who had climbed the 7 highest peaks on Earth more or less left us with the message that there's nothing that you can't do as long as you're willing to leave a couple of Sherpas in a crevasse someplace. So, emboldened by this, I attempted my assault on the peak early Sunday morning after becoming well rested so as to ensure I had time to reach the peak and return to base camp in Building 46 before sunset. My Sherpas had instructed me to carry plenty of caffeine, which is said to increase stamina at high altitudes. And standing atop Mount Sergei and surveying all around me, I reflected upon the fact that I was astride what could only be described as a powerful metaphor. But for what? Because I was reminded at that moment that I was standing atop a monumental heap of, well, garbage. And I was reminded by what you might ask, and the answer is the smell, of course. So, gazing down from Mount Sergei at the carnival tents, I was seized by a powerful sense of deja vu, that sense that I'd been there before. And of course I had. It was during the days when that ritual chanting that you heard opening this talk emanated from the carnival tents behind me over there. It was a performance by the Grateful Dead in June of 1995 when, much to our surprise, the Gyuto monks of Tibet stepped out and did that impromptu throat singing performance that you heard at the opening of the talk. And I found myself thinking about Joseph Campbell and ritual and the fact that the hills were alive with, well, what you heard when the talk opened. I was horrified to hear myself using that line. But they were alive with something else, and that something else was large rodents, because even then it was obvious that this whole place, this entire ritual encampment, was built upon a big, monstrous pile of refuge. So, why do you guys need to know this? You're in the meme pool cartography business and you sell eyeballs. Why should you care about whether your software is any good? Whoever looks at it. When do eyeballs ever gaze upon it? Well, let me tell you why I care, and I'll hope that you do too. But first, let me tell you about this scene from a nightmare. It's those of you who've taken any of my courses know I like to open with this slide. This is one of two slides I always put in all my talks. And I'm fond of asking people, now no cheating if you know from having taken one of my courses, if anyone recognizes the man with the shovel. Okay. Close? John Lennon. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the late John Lennon. And what you see before you is literally a scene from a nightmare. This was a nightmare that John had one day in 1967 after having taken a little too much LSD, as was the custom during those days. And he went home and he had this awful nightmare that he was shoveling load after load of spaghetti into the lap of Ringo's Aunt Jessie. And being an artistic sort, he reenacted this scene in what I used to call a perfectly awful movie entitled The Magical Mystery Tour. And they put this scene into the booklet that accompanied the Magical Mystery Tour album. And as it turned out, that was the first record album that I ever bought. They used to use primitive 20th century analog music distribution technology involving grooves and vinyls. Probably most of you are too young to remember it. But this was the first album I'd ever bought, and I was taken with this scene. So years later, when I'd spent 3 or 4 years working in the software industry, I found myself in a position where I was working with really smart people who wrote really, really bad code. They would write something perfectly awful in Fortran, and then they would go into the dumpster and get someone else's code and do something perfectly terrible to that, and there'd be another copy, and then there'd be another copy, and yet another copy. There'd be 13, 15, 18 copies of almost the same thing, and they all looked just like this heap in Aunt Jessie's lap. And as these metastasized, you'd be put under the you'd be put to the chore of maintaining all of them. And this is what got me interested in the question of, was there a better way? Because I came to realize that John Lennon's nightmare was my nightmare and our nightmare too. And began to search for an answer to the question of, was there a way out? So let me cut to 10 years later, when we'd found ourselves asking the question, in the light of all the high-minded architectural discussion that had been going on, was there in fact something missing? Was there something that people hadn't been talking about? We said something like this. I've always thought I couldn't put this better myself, and in fact, I can't. So it goes something like this. Well, much attention has been focused on high-level architectural patterns. What is, in effect, the de facto standard software architecture is seldom discussed. The ball of mud paper examines the most frequently deployed of software architectures, the big ball of mud. A ball of mud's a casually, even haphazardly structured system. Its organization, if you can call it that, is dictated more by expediency than design. Yet its enduring popularity cannot merely be indicative of a general disregard for architecture. A ball of mud's a haphazardly structured, sprawling, sloppy duct tape and baling wire spaghetti code jungle. We've all seen them. Some of us have built them. These systems show unmistakable signs of unregulated growth and repeated expedient repair. Information is shared promiscuously among distant elements of the system, often to the point where nearly all important information becomes global or duplicated. Only those who are unconcerned about architecture and perhaps are comfortable with the inertia of the day-to-day chore of patching holes in these failing dikes are content to work on such systems. Still, the approach endures and thrives. What makes this architecture so popular? Is it as bad as it seems, or is it a way station on the road to something more enduring, to more elegant artifacts? What causes good programmers to build ugly systems? Can we avoid it? Should we? And how can we make such systems better? What you see here is a shanty town in Frank Lloyd Wright's Mile High, Illinois. It would have been one of the most magnificent skyscrapers ever constructed, but it was never built. He wanted a square mile of land around it and had all these other high-minded ideas as to how it should be put together, and they never did figure out what to do with the elevators, at least in a conclusive sort of way. So before I continue, I should give a nod to my co-author and buddy in this enterprise, Joe Yoder. Joe's depicted here engaged in what I can only presume is some bizarre agile trust-building exercise in the skies over Brazil. Joe and I fathered a small family of brain children back during the reign of William IV, that is to say, the fourth United States president named William. I reckon time by the reigns of the American regents and find numbering them as if they were British kings amusing. As an American born in what's nominally the UK, I came by it honestly, I suppose. So our brain children now are something like 8, 9, 10, and 12 years old, and yes, brain children can have two daddies. The way I usually describe our collaborative relationship is that I'm responsible for all the good parts and Joe's responsible for all the bad parts. Of course, Joe gets to say the same thing when he does this material. There's a lot of benefits that come from not working alone. However, if you come across a passage you find particularly disagreeable, there's a pretty good chance Yoder wrote it. Furthermore, it takes a village to raise a brainchild, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention our intellectual paternity debt, and yes, they are all male, and the pun with pattern is intentional, that this work goes to the likes of Fred Brooks, who wrote the magnificent Mythical Man Month and my favorite software engineering paper of all time, which is Essence and Accident in Software Engineering. Big Ball of Mud also owns a tremendous debt to Stuart Brand, Mr. Holler's catalog, and the author of the wonderful How Buildings Learn. Then, of course, there's Ralph Johnson, our spiritual mentor at the University of Illinois, the man whose Worse is Better paper almost caused us to not bother to write this paper, the poet laureate of the Patterns movement, Richard P. Gabriel. Testing maven Brian Merrick is the guy who came up with the line Big Ball of Mud and first applied it to this architecture in Ralph Johnson's software engineering reading groups. And of course, there's none other than Berkeley's Christopher Alexander, who's another spiritual father of the Patterns movement and the guy who's pompous writing style we strove so valiantly to emulate in Big Ball of Mud. And of course, there's Neil B. Harrison, who was responsible for, he's my co-pilot on the Patterns of Programming Language Design 4 volume, where this work finally formally appeared. And of course, a nod to the Gang of Four, and a special nod to the late John Glacides, depicted here, helping Ralph Johnson and Eric Gamma eat their words 10 years after the publication of the Gang of Four book. Now, there was always an emperor's new clothes quality to this particular work, and something that probably is worthy of an explanation. But first, I feel as if I should mention it's kind of intimidating downstairs to look at all the Turing Award winners who've gotten to speak at this place. And the Turing Award is pretty prestigious, I suppose. It's often been described as a Nobel Prize in computer science, I presume in the same sense that a daytime Emmy is the Nobel Prize in soap opera. But you really know you've made it when your work has been slash-dotted. And this paper, I think that's the highest honor that our field has to bestow. And this paper has been slash-dotted not once, but twice. And I can tell you from personal experience, because this paper lives in our living room at home, that getting slash-dotted is a very effective denial of service attack. Now, this paper could be seen as yet another retelling of Hans Christian Andersen's classic, The Emperor's New Clothes. At least it's the tale of worse is better. We almost didn't write it for that way. But one of the things that's most remarkable about this paper, as I think back on it, is that in the 10 years, and yes, it has been 10 years since we first started working on it, it was first presented at Plot 97, no one has ever challenged our premise. No one has ever said, no, it isn't the most frequently deployed architecture out there. It isn't what we're all doing. There's something really profound going on, and I think it ultimately has to do with Brooks's notion of essential complexity. We're trying to do something complicated, and in modeling a complicated world, why isn't our software complicated? It may come down to that in the end, and there's a lot more that can be said about that. But before we do that, I think I'll take us on a bit of a tour through a couple of different spots. One is the realm of metaphor, and the other is the patterns that are actually in the paper. I might add that with me and brain children, it's a breech birth every time. Even as brain children go, this one had a long gestation period. It wasn't really finished. The last piece wasn't in place until around 2000. But the idea was to contrast this with what everybody else seemed to be doing and saying, and here's how the story went. But before I begin the story, does anyone recognize this guy? Anyone? Okay. It's Kent Beck. Kent Beck's one of the most remarkable figures the OO community's produced. I met him about 20 years ago when he got me an under-the-table copy of the Apple Smalltalk interpreter. His brain children are numerous. The father of the pattern movement, Smalltalk evangelist, with Ward, one of the original pair programmers. He's the Vince Lombardi of extreme programming. He brought the word coach to our field. I think it's been said that real genius exhibits itself in the gaps between disciplines. And for this reason, I think it's one of the reasons why Kent will be remembered as the founder of the field of computational scatology, because this notion of code smells and unified with software engineering, computer science, has really revolutionized the way that we think about code. But that's not really what I'm going to focus on here. One of my favorite Beck moments was a talk he gave at OOPSLA 2002 on metaphor. It was really one of the most courageous things I'd ever seen, because he talked about how the war on metaphor was working so badly with respect to the war on terror. And he addressed the issue of maybe whether a different metaphor, maybe disease, maybe something else might have been more effective. And this idea of metaphor had always been one of the pillars of the Agile movement. And I think in terms of things I could add to the discussion beyond what you could get out of reading our desultory spasm of pomposity right here, that emphasizing some of that might be the most effective thing I can do. Yeah, he's also unified software engineering in literature, football, architecture. He's just out there between the gaps. But code smells was a fun metaphor in itself. I like to use this slide in our classes. In Illinois, we don't have a whole lot of words to describe what happens when you don't like a glass of wine. We can drink a glass of wine and we can say, well, that's really kind of good, or that sucks. But we don't have the vocabulary you Californians have. We can't say that it's overripe or oxidized or lemony or grapefruity. Out here, when you do a wine tasting, it's a verbal slugfest. And we look at this and you ask yourself the question, wouldn't it be great if we had a vocabulary like this for talking about just what was wrong with code? And it turns out we do. There's a long-established vocabulary of code smells. They're beyond the scope of this particular talk, but this is one case where this notion of taking a metaphor and beating it to death has served us really well. Metaphor is important because it's interesting to ask ourselves the question, what the hell is it that we make all day? And as far as I can tell, what we really do goes something like this, and this is the only part that's real. We're meticulously, delicately choreographing a miniature bonsai thunderstorm rolling across a delicately sculpted bonsai silicon plane. Every bolt, every strike, pregnant and laden with meaning. A diorama in silicon and metal. It's a stage, it's a dance, but with every gesture scripted, every tiny lingering bolt of lightning ripe with meaning. A thunderstorm isn't about anything, but our toy thunderstorms are. Our toy thunderstorms mean something to us. The rest is just baggage that we assign in the realm of semiotics and metaphor. And metaphor matters. It's how we get from that silicon plane and the thunderstorm to the stuff that we think about when we think about code. And if we don't understand how it is that we think about this stuff all day, what it is we're actually visualizing, what it is that we mean by it, what those strings are, then figuring out how to keep it from turning into Mount Sergey and Mount Larry back there, Sergey, sorry, is going to be something that will be difficult to do. So, metaphor matters. How many of you have ever bitten the head off of a chicken? Or any bird whatsoever? How many of you have ever been referred to by a civilian as a geek? Quite a few of you. This is the reason I'll never subscribe to Vonage, because metaphor matters. Let's talk about where mud comes from. Where does it come from? What is the reason that good code goes bad? Why should software ever need repair? Software doesn't break, and software doesn't heal. Software doesn't rust like iron. Termites do not attack it. Water does not erode it. Insects do not nest in it. The only vermin that attack software are programmers. Software has no natural enemies. Its only known enemy, its most dangerous enemy, is man. So where does bad code come from? Where do you think it comes from? Anyone want to venture a guess? Bad programmers? Good programmers. Does it come from, go? Every programmer but that guy right there. I think that about covers it. So, good architecture, bad architecture. I've seen a lot of things called good code, but I'll be damned if I can read some of it. Maybe I'm lazy, but I don't know. What's up there? Sometimes it seems as if code is one of those things like poetry and weblog posts that we're just better at writing and enjoy writing more than we enjoy reading. You know, as a first approximation, maybe the problem is nobody looks at this stuff. Of course, mud could just be a broader manifestation of a broader Dilbertian dystopia that our cube farms have become. It could just be Conway's law writ large, but let's see. I think this paper actually began in 1994 when I was listening to Desmond Decker's 007 Shantytown, and found myself thinking, as I so often do when I do nearly anything, that whatever it is I'm doing would be a great metaphor for talking about software. And this was in the context of thinking about the difference between all the high-minded architectural patterns that people were proposing and what we saw every day. And the wrap in the paper goes something like this. Shantytowns are squalid, sprawling slums. Everyone seems to agree they're a bad idea, but forces conspire to promote their emergence anyway. What are these people doing right? Shantytowns are usually built from common, inexpensive materials and simple tools. Shantytowns can be built using relatively unskilled labor. Even though the labor force is, quote, unskilled in the customary sense, the construction and maintenance of this sort of housing can be quite labor intensive and quite complex. There's little specialization, though. Each housing unit is constructed and maintained primarily by its inhabitants, and each inhabitant must be a jack of all the necessary trades. There's little concern for architecture, since infrastructure requires coordination and capital, and specialized resources, equipment, and skill. There is little overall planning or regulation of growth. Shantytowns emerge where there's a need for housing, a surplus of unskilled labor, and a dearth of capital investment. Shantytowns fulfill an immediate local need for housing by bringing available resources to bear on the problem, and lofty architectural goals are a luxury that has to wait. Now, this vision of undercapitalized lone wolves doing the best they can with whatever materials they've got might be one place where mud begins. But let's try another metaphor. And, well, the mound builders of Mountain View carried the materials for their mastiffs to the site in vehicles like this one. They didn't think at first that they were in the mountain building business, but they were. A leading cause of mud is an expedient attitude towards throwaway code. It might be that quick and dirty script you didn't think anyone would ever look at again. It's code that was intended to be discarded. However, as is often the case, code, being in that it does something useful, serves some useful purpose, lives on. And in doing so, it's subject to modification. And we all know what happens when programmers get their hands on code that they don't understand. Do you think they make it better? Most of the time, they make it worse. One man gathers what another man spills, and being in that it's bad to begin with, does it get better once people start beating on it? What do you think? You know, code repair and refactoring, we use this analogy a lot. A lot of people use this analogy. Any of you in college remember what it was like to have to live in shared housing and have to deal with the kitchen? You'd make a meal, and normally when you make a meal, you clean up the kitchen so that the next meal may someday be prepared in the same space. But if you defer cleaning up the kitchen 1 day, 2 days, 5 days, 10 days, what starts to happen? Well, for one thing, bugs start to appear. Eventually, the Board of Health shows up and shuts down the premises and things of that sort, but a lot of ugly stuff happens in the meantime. Messy kitchens are a good illustration, especially our good old-fashioned collegiate messy kitchens, of a notion that we call technical debt. It's okay when you're working on something to let things get a little out of hand, to let entropy increase. But if you don't engage in some entropy decreasing activity, you're going to get yourself into a world of hurt. Messy kitchens are one illustration of that. All too much of our code is another. In fact, there's to switch metaphors, and I don't know if I'm good at a lot of things, but I can mix a metaphor faster than a Manhattan barkeep can mix a martini. Let's go to another metaphor, and that's agriculture. Slash and burn, it's one of those things we all think it's terrible, but people do it. What are the forces that impel them to do it? Maybe the only thing selling is a robber crop, like tobacco. Maybe They don't even understand the basic laws of agriculture and what have you. They don't know that they're robber crops. Anyone think of a programming language that we might analogize as producing robber crops? Might be fun to think about it. But slash and burn agricultural practices are as old as agriculture. Sustainable yields and real honest-to-God sod busting would be preferable, but all too many people get onto projects, beat the heck out of the code, and move on to the next project. The code dies, the code's unmaintainable, nothing else can grow there, the enterprise founders. It's the end of the story. Another place from which bad code comes is from small volumes of good code that grow in an unregulated fashion. Edward Abbey, environmentalist, activist, and writer, has said that growth for growth's sake is the ideology of the cancer cell. Now, this cut and paste nightmare that I'm talking about is the same one that I talked about when I showed you the slide filled with the spaghetti. Bad code comes from the duplication of good code, the metastasis of good code, the divergence of good code. And when people don't come back and refactor the commonalities, the bad code, each of which might have been decent in its own right, proliferates, duplicates, and pretty soon the entire system becomes unmaintainable. You could say that expedient code copying has been observed to be a characteristic of the early exploratory phase, the evolution of object-oriented components, but the virtual indispensability of indispensability of framework developers has been less widely acknowledged. The thing that's least widely acknowledged is just how common this is. And it's easy to see that. Is there anyone here who hasn't used cut and paste to get a job done sometime during the last year? I mean, everybody, it's really, my God. Everybody does it. It's one of those things everybody does that isn't widely acknowledged. And the reason that it works is you take something that's working rather than build something from the ground up. You put it in a little sandbox and you start to beat on it until you take it from what it is and turn it into whatever it is you need. Then you declare victory and you move on typically. And it's only that final stage that's something that should really be disparaged. You know, in the genome, one of the ways we manage to survive is that we'll do something like take a hemoglobin gene, which works just fine, stick it on another chromosome, and then let it start turning into something else. Most of the time, it turns into something that doesn't produce anything useful at all, and that's the end of the story. But every once in a while, those genes mutate in such a way so that something even more useful comes of that copying. And you could see that as a path towards something better on occasion. It's a difficult process to manage, but cut and paste isn't totally of the devil. Now, this is a picture of, it's called the Queen City of Death Valley. For a brief period of time, it was the second largest city in Nevada. It had schoolhouses, it had all manner of brothels. Its concern for infrastructure was commendable. You know, they built all kinds of things for a town that they'd hoped would be around for a long time, but it turned out that this town didn't last for very long at all. 100 years ago, it was thriving. A couple of years later, it was completely gone. From shanty towns to boom towns to ghost towns to our towns, too many of our systems are like mining towns or railroad camps. They're tent cities, Quonset huts, squatter shacks, dens of gamblers, thieves, what have you. Does this sound familiar? Are these similarities merely metaphorical, or are there underlying technical and financial concerns these domains have in common? You can almost imagine a saloon filled with Mountain Dew slamming, hard hacking bit slingers pontificating and locking horns over indentation styles and Hungarian notation while they squander their winnings on overclocked game machines. The piano player is an iPod, of course. Now, in contrast to this, there's this notion of piecemeal growth. For some reason, I've never really been able to explain myself. Big Ball of Mud exhibits an amazing fascination with Soviet-era technology, which is actually a fascination I've had since my youth. And it was interesting to contrast the manner in which the Mir space station was able to gracefully accommodate growth, especially as contrasted with the poster child of reuse horror stories that was the space shuttle in those days. The core was put up in 1986, and over the years, the modules managed to accumulate because they were, in fact, designed in a manner to make the system extensible. In fact, in 1995, the docking module to accommodate American space shuttles, which was a development that couldn't possibly been imagined in pre-Gorbachev era Russia, was added, and the first phase of the International Space Station program was begun. But piecemeal growth has with it, in some ways, being the cure, also the seeds of its own demise. And we'll look more at those as we go. Now, one of my favorite patterns in this collection was shearing layers. This was an idea that we got straight from Stuart Brand. It was an observation from the architectural world. It was the notion of changing things that change separating things that change quickly from things that don't change as quickly. What changes most quickly in a software application? Presumably, it's the data. One way we can cope with change, one way we can keep the code from getting squalid, is to push decisions out onto the users and into the data. Now, among the things that change more slowly are code and particularly programming languages. So there's sort of this, there's this hierarchy, at least there's this strata of things that are able to accommodate change at different rates. And one of the problems that we'd always see with top-down designs is that they would prohibit people from taking advantage of the knowledge, the feedback that came from observing the rate of these changes at the time when they had the information. And then there's sprawl. It was in Washington, D.C. That's where I heard that Agile keynote. And it's interesting to contrast the different growth styles of communities that were planned with a skeleton of some sort and those that were not. Washington is one of them. Abuja is one. Brasilia is one. Then we've got the Levitt towns of the world, the modularly constructed houses. Here's a double wide somewhere. Maybe we could tell from the phone number where it is. One of the things that we've learned over the last decade or so seems to be something along the lines of modules just haven't really lived up to the potential that everyone thought that they were going to have. People don't want to build skyscrapers out of a pile of double wides. You really can't seem to compose them in that fashion. Modular housing seems to have failed because no one wants to live there. Instead, they seem to want to have structures which are crafted with the requirements at hand, integrated in a fashion that is fitted to the space and the problem and the inhabitants. And this is something that modules don't always do well, but that pattern-based designs and more labor-intensive designs do well. Now, what do you do when you've got one of these things? Here's some more Soviet-era technology. This is the sarcophagus around Reactor 3 at Chernobyl, one of the most famous technology failures in the history of engineering. And it's one thing to talk about things you can do to prevent balls of mud, and we will, but it's another thing to talk about things you can do once you've got one on your hands. What on earth do you do when you've got one of these festering, steaming, venting piles of God knows what? And what you can start to do is at least try to contain it. Now, in general, this problem of taking an existing ball of mud and disentangling it is as intricate and challenging and desperate and deadly a problem as separating Siamese twins. I hear about twin separation surgeries that take 20 hours, and I listen to the stories about the doctors and the way that they plan these things, and I think about some of the balls of mud I've seen and find myself thinking, these guys have the easy problem. We've got things that are so tangled, they're so filled with spaghetti that separating them is a monumental architectural challenge, and yet that's one of the things we have to do. This picture here depicts what you had to do in order to build the great mounds, the great ceremonial mounds of Mountain View, these works of man. My dad used to do a job like this. You'd have to take one of these big pieces of heavy equipment. They call those guys, the guys who drive them, engineers as well. And you'd have to cap the thing. You'd first have to find a way to contain the ooze that was running out of the things, and then move from there to try and gentrify it a little more in the kind of fashion that we see around here. What strategy do you apply? Well, I think this guy pretty much summed it up. We can't really do a whole lot better than what Julius Caesar called divide and conquer when it comes to figuring out how you take a big undifferentiated mass of something and turn it into something more differentiated. Then, of course, if you can't fix it at all, you're faced with the kind of decision that the builders of the great baseball cookie cutters of the 1960s or the Pruitt-Igoe housing projects were faced with, and that's that you have to blow it up altogether. You know, I think this is another interesting reuse horror story. The problem with these cookie cutter stadia was they tried to build a facility that was good for baseball and good for football and good for rock and roll, and they succeeded in pleasing no one. And the reason was, in those days, each of those wasn't sufficiently well capitalized to justify the expense of building customized, tailored, better facilities for each of those activities by itself. You know, I think as the wealth associated with each became greater, the possibility of not having to compromise like this occurred as well. And I think we see a phenomenon like that with software. But it's worth mentioning that this impulse of tear it down and build another one is what Joel Spolsky has called at various times one of the most dangerous things you can possibly do. Because when you blow something up, when you blow software up, you are blowing up along with it all the hard-won, painfully fought battles in the trenches with entropy to get the thing on the air that will be discarded if you try to do the thing over. In fact, Ball of Mud adamantly recommends the incremental iterative style of keeping something on the air the entire time that you're trying to get something better. And this is a position from which we have not retreated. Now, I'm afraid I have some bad news for you, and that's that the war on bugs is lost. In the generation since Nancy Reagan, consort to Ronald I, implored us to say, no to bugs, America's bug problem is worse than ever. Bugs are kind of like prime numbers. By now, we're pretty much resigned to the fact that we can never find the last one, but after the first billion or so, they start to thin out a little bit. So just saying no to bugs didn't work. They're still in our schools, in our code. We spent billions trying to fight them. Bug traffickers reap fortunes. We call them software companies. They hire lawyers, these bug cartels. I'd name them, but they'd cut me down in a hail of bullet points. It's not a problem of enforcement. It's not something we can simply make disappear via, say, stronger type checking. The supply of bugs is larger than ever, and attempts at domestic crackdowns have just driven bug production overseas. The old story sounded something like this. You'd start with gateway bugs. First, you'd neglect a few error returns. You'd let a couple of exceptions get by unchecked. The next thing you know, it's on to the NP hard stuff, a dependency injection overdose, perhaps even deadlock. The war on bugs has diverted attention from things that work, and the things that work are these: testing, prevention, and treatment. I mean, I can't say enough about testing. You know, if all the practices that have emerged over the last 20 years, out there way beyond the formal logistic train, way beyond what the type checkers can keep us out of trouble by doing, this notion of having the tests have your back has made a bigger difference than any other practice I've seen. Prevention. If you can keep your code via a regimen of constant, iterative, incremental refactoring from subsiding into a ball of mud, you can save yourself a lot of expensive treatment. Treatment, of course, sometimes means putting a containment vessel atop the festering mass. More often, it's about communicating with others who have the same problem. communication is actually one of the things that can keep code from going down the drain. In an organization like yours, where you have, and I think this is admirable, small commando teams who are broadly advancing on a number of fronts, I call this the Agile Ike model, it's necessary to somehow manage to coordinate their activities, not by telling them what to do, but at least by making sure that everybody knows what everybody else is doing. Treatment is better than checking your code into rehab. It's about communicating with others that share your plight. One way of thinking about this might be to use Rudy Giuliani and Malcolm Gladwell's broken windows analogy. Now, I've yet to officially endorse a candidate for the next election, and this is not the time or place for me to do so. But one thing that these guys did that was admirable is this notion of fixing the little things, of fixing the broken windows, of taking the graffiti down. If you take that attitude towards refactoring your code, if you fix the little things, then an atmosphere where you can fix the bigger things starts to become easier to see. We thought about a sequel to Big Ball of Mud, about the return of the swamp thing. We're still working on aspects of that. One way to think about draining these swamps might be to think about what Theodore Roosevelt and Walter Reed and whatnot confronted when it came time to build the Panama Canal. It's the same argument as broken windows, but I love to mix metaphors or similes or whatever you want to call them. And metaphor is more highbrow than simile, but simile is just fine. It's like this. You know, a focus on sanitation was necessary to get the Panama Canal built. It was first by draining the swamps and dealing with the little bugs that the major problems were addressed, and that's a nice metaphor. It'd probably be a good time now to talk about some newer material. This is an idea that might have gone into a Ball of Mud sequel. We called it the big bucket of glue. Some of these ideas that I'm talking about here were in fact conceived in the same round windowless room at Larry Smarr's National Center for Supercomputer Applications, where Mark Andreessen and Eric Bina first devised the first modern web browser and its corresponding server, Mosaic. I call it the first modern browser because it had pictures, unlike those European browsers. So they've never been knighted, but they did receive the highest honors that America can bestow, which of course are wealth and celebrity. Now, I think this room ought to be declared a World Heritage Historical Site. You know, they finally did put up a plaque to honor Mosaic, but it's in front of the new NCSA building, referred to by some as the Mosaic Mausoleum, rather than in front of Mosaic's actual birthplace. But the code bases live on arguably to this day. Both the Mozilla threads and the Spyglass branches live on to this day, and both have been referred to famously as poster children for the big ball of mud problem. Now, the bucket of glue idea actually is one that came out of the original Mosaic code. And the idea is something like this. A lot of what we're seeing these days, there wasn't a lot of new code in the original Mosaic. Instead, it was just a bucket of glue. It held together a bunch of existing open source and easy to come by applications. And there wasn't that much new in it at all. It probably would have been a good addition to this collection, although the collection was done at the time. And it's probably, these days, one of the most commonly deployed architectures in the services world. A word about services. There's this notion, I remember this from an old Star Trek episode. There was an episode where Spock was talking to Ambassador Callus or something of that sort in Is There No Truth in Beauty, I believe it was called. And this was this guy who, if you ever gazed upon him, would drive you completely insane. You couldn't actually stare at the ambassador, or you would go completely bonkers, which in fact did happen in the episode. The Medusa was an apparition so hideous that all who gazed upon her were turned to stone. I think we've got this problem in the services layer these days. The ball of mud phenomenon has not only not gone away, but I think that at this new layer that we're building atop the stuff that we already built, some of which was only merely adequate to begin with, the duct tape and baling wire that we're using to sew all of these things together are an absolute horror show. It seems that a lot of us probably couldn't stare at some of these things without going completely insane. And tools and mechanisms for making this better would certainly be welcome. And as a conclusion to all of this, I'd say this. Tools are probably one of the most important things that we can focus on if we're to make this problem of awful code better. I mean, code is just bits. Computers will execute bits just fine. But we need metaphor and we need tools to be able to cultivate them so that human beings can stand them. That's John Henry on the left and the steam drill on the right. We all know what happened to John Henry. We built a lot of refactoring tools at Illinois in the old days when I hung around there. That's Agile-like. We'll skip him. Well, all right, it's a fun story. If Ike had been Agile, he'd have said, okay, I'll take my 500,000 guys, I'll divide them up into 50,000 commando teams and say, France is that way, here's the guy you want to get. And there'd be a certain coordination problem. Yeah, we'll skip that one. I always try to get a picture of my dog into one of these talks. And the pretext I've got for doing this time is Dick Gabriel's notion of habitability. Code is habitable when the people who live there, when the people who spend time around it every day have a sense of it being a decent place to work. My dog is named Laika. She was named after the first dog in space. We're nearing the 50th anniversary of a couple of remarkable Soviet-era achievements, me being a Soviet-era space bump. We've got the 50th anniversary of Sputnik in October and of the first living creature, a canine, being launched into space coming up in November. And it was in honor of that canine that we named our dog. The reason I'm bringing this up here is if you can generate code, I mean, if we make programmers go away, a lot of the problems we've got with making code readable, making it a good place to live go away. It's more expensive to have people live someplace, like space or in code, than it is to generate it automatically. But as long as we're doing that, for a lot of the same reasons that we ought to have smoke-free workplaces, code ought to be something that we can stand to be around. And if nothing else, this is a lecture in those directions. So we all know the answer, right? So this is it's been branded and well documented. So let me associate a couple of words with the answer. Testing. Nothing I've seen in the last 20 years has had as big an impact as testing. And of course, that stands on the shoulder of objects. Refactoring. There's simply no question that we can't nail these things on the first attempt, that the incremental, iterative, quasi-agile way of thinking about the world that we talked about in here has largely won the day. But we often honor it in the breach. And metaphor. Our systems, our programs, our code, they've got to be about something. They've got to tell a story. They've got to be something that a human being can stand to look at and a human being can understand. And that's the place where I think we've been slowest to be able to make progress. I think that's the place where more work needs to be done. There's been some really good work done on notions of domain-specific architecture, even domain-specific languages, but a lot of our code still looks like something that you wouldn't want to show your mother, let alone your colleagues. And with that, I'd like to thank Gregor Hoppe for setting this up, Josh Karievsky for getting me into this place, and Rick Balaka for putting up with me when I'm in town. And at this point, I've heard that questions at Google can make a Guantanamo Bay interrogation look like an Oprah Winfrey appearance, but hey, let's see what you got. Go. I have no idea. It's back over there.
So where are all these elegant, commercially successful code bases?
Heck if I know. You know, I got a good story about that. There was a guy we were talking to who was you may be making my point here. There was a guy I was talking to who was a game developer, and he came in and said, you know, our company just went out of business, and it's really frustrating because we came up with this really great framework for building these things. It was the most elegant code you could ever have possibly imagined. And I asked him why his company went out of business, and it was because nobody liked the games. You know, I found myself imagining a kid saying, oh, dude, this game really sucks. But yeah, it's got a really elegant code base. I mean, this is why the guy blew it in the market. And you know, I don't know the answer to your question. In fact, I think it may be reinforcing the point that elegance doesn't always make it in a fast-moving marketplace. I think it was one of the points we make in here is you miss your market window, you're already dead, so the slash and burn guy is going to be way ahead of you. Slash and burn works. A lot of these things work. You know, it's an ugly world out there. And so, do you know?
No, I think if I was evaluating a startup as an engineer, I'd want to see, and if I saw, I'd see as a company smell would be a too elegant code base and not enough shipping.
I was curious if you think of people being sort of rational and, you know, we're all doing our best job, and yet we observe all this copy paste. And I was wondering, like, oh, is there something rational going on there? Is there can we characterize the environments where copy paste is totally appropriate? And then, you know, so we do that first, then we sort of switch to some other mode. Are there some signs we could look for?
I think that's what I always do, actually. If, you know, if, as is the case in the 21st century, there are very few greenfields projects, and we seldom are writing command line applications, but instead we're doing things that have GUIs in them and talk to all kinds of other things that are already done. The way you just about get anything on the air is rather than building it from first principles from the ground up, you say, well, I got this pile of stuff over here that kind of looks like it. You know, I need an airplane, so I'll take, I don't know, a Volkswagen. I'll plop it over here, but I won't wreck the Volkswagen plans because, hey, that's working. They sell a lot of those. So I'll put it down over here. I'll slap some wings on it, you know. And I'll goose up the horsepower on the engine, and I'll put a propeller on, the back of it because I'm not an aeronautical engineer. And after a while, I may get something that could get off the ground, and then I'll just refactor it into, say, a 737. You know, it sounds preposterous, but I think it's a state-of-the-art approach. You know, this paper in part came out because a friend of mine was an expert witness in a trial involving a really awful pile of RPG code. And the basis of the suit was that the people who had commissioned the software had paid for a state-of-the-art system. My friend was describing this system, and I said to him, you know what? That is the state-of-the-art. And he managed to get them off. They settled out of court. But it was one of those things that made us write the paper. Yeah, go ahead.
One of the reasons I think that balls of mud persist is it's just so expensive and not worth justifying re-architecting something. Re-architecting is like, you know, removing the spine and replacing the skeleton on a living human being, and who in their right mind would do that if you can make, you know, little incremental improvements and kind of, you know, cover over the parts that are ugly. It's like there's no intrinsic value to the architecture except that it may block you from doing something. And it seems like, you know, isn't the main reason people re-architect if you actually can't do something that somebody decides you have to do?
Probably. No, it probably is the main reason that people... the flip side of that fanciful example of, oh, we want an airplane is sometimes it seems like in the realm of software requirements, people can't tell the difference. You know, they say, you've got this application, why can't you just put some wings on it? You know, they really don't perceive that the difference between what they want and what they've already got. I mean, since it's just bits, it's as great as it is. People don't perceive that you go against the grain of certain things that are already present in a system, and it's just not possible to get there from here. You know, I used to walk to work in an old neighborhood where people were doing a lot of remodeling, and one day I saw them lifting up a house to put a new foundation underneath it. And I thought to myself, gee, that's so labor intensive and that's, you know, just so physical. I'm sure glad that I work with bits. And the thing I was trying to do that week was refactor an object-oriented framework to make just one of these, make precisely one of these sorts of pivots. You know, from a set of requirements that I adequately addressed, kind of nailed, to another set that were really going against the grain. And I walked by this place every day for 3 or 4 days, and at the end of 3 or 4 days, they were done replacing the foundation of this house. And I hadn't begun to figure out how the hell I was going to pull the foundation out from under this framework. And it was at that point I realized that it was legitimately and actually way more expensive to do what I was doing than what they had just done. You know, software was just not malleable at all in that way. That
Okay.
was eye-opening, yeah.
So I like the picture of you had of building an airplane out of a car. As you know, Saab is actually an airplane factory which ended up building cars, and we were the first ones to put the car in the wind tunnel, because what else do you do when you
What do you do with that?
actually
Yeah.
design something which
Right.
is
It's
going
a little
to
over-designed,
move?
but-
So they essentially built the car from airplane parts, and that's a thriving industry. So I want to turn the thing around. It's like, okay, we can't get rid of the balls of mud, right? But how about making sure if the balls of mud are really small, and we can build them such, and they do what they're supposed to do really easy to write, less code,
You're
a better
one of those
programming
dependency
language.
injection slamming guys, I think. It's, the
so how about
ravioli code thing is actually pretty cool, and that's one of the neatest things I've seen since I've been around here. But the problem with it is it's buying into that bucket of glue problem at that next level. You've then got to figure out, how do you sew all of these things together? You do it with bots. Can anybody read the things that actually pull it all together? I mean, if something's going to generate code for me, I want it to nail it. You know, I don't want to have to read it. You know, it's like a Channel DeForest Kelly and say, I don't want to read any code that was written by a damn computer. You know, if it's going to be generated, it's got to be something that you're not supposed to tinker with, at least for my taste. And that's where the gamble is with this. I mean, the component factory idea goes all the way back to Brad Cox. And I remember there was a workshop at OOPSLA 87 where he talked about how long it would take for there to be a reusable component marketplace. And he predicted it would take 20 years. And we were all horrified at that time horizon. You know, everybody expected it to happen really fast. Still not here.
Hi. You mentioned about testing as a
I
good
did.
thing.
I
The
like
part that I don't like about testing is that you have to write code to make tests.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, like today I have to go fix some tests that are not properly done. We're not testing anything. So that I want to hear your thoughts about that. And the second one is that I also want to hear a little bit about more the failure of components, as was sold to us was the solution for the software problem.
Okay, let's see. There's something addictive about writing tests, and I kind of like to write code, and it doesn't really bother me to write tests, because the thing that I really dislike about programming are those days when what you're doing just rubs your nose so badly in your own fallibility that you can't stand it. You know, and that's what heavy-duty, nightmarish debugging sessions can do. And my experience has been that I can save myself being in that position more effectively by writing modest amounts of test code than by doing anything else I've ever learned how to do. So it kind of becomes a virtuous circle. As for components, it's such a beguiling vision. You know, it's been this thing that has been, like the sirens calling us for 20 years. If we could just figure out how to factor this space properly, we could just pull everything off the shelf, and all these problems would go away. And here it's partially a metaphor issue. It's where in this space were the things that really are the bricks, that really were in the supply chain, that really were going to be reusable. You know, people went down the double wide from Decatur route and couldn't get the components right. It's not that it's an insane vision. It's just that in its execution, figuring out what the virtual software engineering world's analogs to those things really were has proven to be a much bigger problem. I mean, software is so broad, so diverse. I mean, the very breadth of what we do and still call it software is just enormous. And it could be that for all of those disciplines, the basic materials are are fundamentally different in that we just thought it was going to be easier to just build that, the whole world out of Legos. It's a software engineering guru Michael Jackson used to talk about that, not that other one, not the Neverland guy. He used to talk about how software engineers would do something like, oh, steel's a great building material. Let's build the whole car out of steel. So you'd have windows with steel mesh on them. The whole damn thing would be steel. We just like to take anything. A parka is a great solution to the problem of clothing a human. So let's wear them all the time. If we can demonstrate a situation in which a parka isn't practical, you can take it down to Copacabana Beach, not practical. Well, then it's been refuted. We need to find another way to solve the problem. I mean, one of the things we learned in the patterns movement from Alexander was the importance of context. And there's just all kinds of context dependencies in coming up with these vocabularies of components. It just turned out to be a big, fat, interesting problem. But I think the ravioli code movement is actually making some headway there finally, and I think that is actually quite promising. Andy. Thank you. All right.